You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Malfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of The Examined Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. Now, I'm going to attempt to make this maybe a little bit of a shorter one, not try and only go about 30 or 45 minutes this week, because I am still in the midst of packing and moving my whole family and household from our current house to another house, and that's taking an immense amount of time. In fact, I'm recording this here in my office, and I have a pile of boxes that contain all my books right beside me. It's very sad to look at the shelf and no longer see books on them, but that's what you got to do when you got to move. So anyhow, this time I'm going to go over Deconstructionism and the postmodernistic approach to literature and talk about what the roots of that are. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before when I was talking about criticism and various types of criticism, but I realized when I was listening back to some of those episodes that I didn't really go into it in detail. And I do think it's important to go through it in detail because it's very, very influential in the way people actually think about things and the way literature, art, and movies and films and other things are being produced. And as I've talked about before in this podcast, some of those ideas actually do filter down into the real world. A large amount of the elements of what's now termed critical race theory, well, it's the intellectual grandchildren of things like deconstructionism and postmodernistic philosophy. So it's very important to understand these things, even though I'm going to come away and say most of this is wrong. Well, it's important to understand it, first of all, because not all of it is wrong. Not all of the points that deconstructionists and postmodernists make are wrong. And it's also important to understand it because a lot of people do think in these terms now, even if they don't consciously recognize it, even if they don't know the terms deconstructionism and postmodernism and can't name you the historical figures like Foucault and Derrida who champion these. A lot of people think and act in these terms. A good example of that I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it was a long, long time ago, this is quite a while ago. I think it was like 10 years ago or something, but it was like a big pop culture event at the time when it was at the MTV Movie Awards and Taylor Swift won an award and Kanye West charged the stage and basically grabbed the mic and said that he thought that Beyonce's music video was better and she should have won. Now, everybody kind of looked at that and said, oh, that's rude. How dare he? Well, I looked at that and thought, he's following Nietzsche. Now, I'm under no illusion, I don't think Kanye West either has read Nietzsche or had read Nietzsche at that time, but one of Nietzsche's ideas kind of encapsulated by the will to power, and this is a little bit of a simplification, but the idea was, go make the world in your own image instead of letting the world make you in your image. If you really are that great and that awesome and that wonderful, then you should be remaking the world in your image, which is basically what Kanye West was trying to do there, saying, no, Taylor shouldn't have won. Beyonce should have won. I'm going to go tell everybody this and try and make it happen. Now, most normal people recognize that was pretty rude and wrong of him to do, but in a kind of a loose way, that's a practical application of how Nietzsche said you should live if you have the strength to do it, so to speak. Now, I bring that up not just because it's a good example of that, but because actually the ideas that Postmodernism and Deconstructionism, one of the best ways to explain it actually starts with Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche came to be thought of as kind of like the personification or the exemplar of a philosophical idea called Constructivism. Now, he didn't originate this, and he probably isn't the clearest proponent of it, but it's very, very riddled in everything Nietzsche did. And the idea of Constructivism is essentially that everything we see and do, all of our systems, all of our cultures, all of our religions, it's all constructed. It's all put together from components. And if you haven't thought about this kind of thing before, this might be kind of a hard thing to wrap your mind around. So you need to think of it sort of like this. The U.S. legal system is a construct. That is, it's various different entities and people and components all working together for a certain end. So it's not like it just came out of nowhere. What happened is, way back when the country got started, people said, oh, we need a justice system, and they came up with a idea of how to do it, including the Supreme Court and various other things. And I don't know the history of the U.S. legal system very well, but the point is, the legal system didn't it wasn't something we discovered, say, the laws of physics, or the fact that you can go mine gold out of that mountain, or that there was a dinosaur fossil buried in the strata over there. Those are things you discover. Whereas the legal system is something that we as American people, as a society, through our history, we've constructed it. And so in many senses, if we all wanted to get together and tear it down and start another one, at least in theory we could. Now, practically speaking, that'd be very hard to do for a whole host of reasons. But the point is, the legal system isn't something we discovered, it's something we constructed. So Constructivism, a la Nietzsche, is the idea that everything is constructed in this sense. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to figure out where or how it got constructed. Sometimes it's not as clear who constructed it, but everything is constructed. Everything is constructed by your culture, by your religion, by people, by your perception. Everything is constructed. There isn't really anything that is flat out discovered. At least that's the idea taken to its logical extreme. I don't know if Nietzsche would have actually agreed with it to that point or not, but you can find the idea that things are constructed very prevalent in Nietzsche. Nietzsche hated Christian morality because he thought it was the weak constructing a morality to overthrow the strong, since Christian morality says things like, blessed are the meek. Nietzsche's like, no, blessed are the strong. And what the meek did is they constructed a new morality designed to give them power over the strong, and how dare they? The strong should rule, or loosely speaking, something like that. So morality isn't something we discover, and it's not like an objective thing, it's something that's constructed. And everything is constructed. So that's something to keep in mind. Because if you're talking about deconstructionism, you have to have constructivism first. Now, what I should be readily apparent, if you're thinking clearly, is, well, hang on. Some things are constructed, but some things are not. Our legal system is constructed. Many of the aspects of our society and culture are constructed. There's no logical reason why, or necessary reason why, men wear ties to dress up and women wear dresses. If society wanted to construct it differently, it could have gone differently there. And likewise, even in many things that we think are very important, like, our theological and church government systems and things like that, well, there's certain elements there that are constructed. There's no particular reason why, most of the churches I go to, they have a worship service, and then they have a sermon, and then they have a song or two after the sermon. Well, why didn't you have the sermon first and then the worship service? There isn't really a necessary reason it has to go that way. It's just kind of the way most churches in America have decided to do things, and that's the way we keep doing things. That element of how we do Christianity in America is constructed. Now, it doesn't follow from that everything about Christianity is constructed. We did not construct the idea that a Jewish man claimed to be the Son of God, the second person in the Trinity, and died on a cross and rose again to give us grace and is from our sins. That's something that happened historically speaking. And I've added some theological language to that because I am a Christian. But the point being, most of the time when you look at the world, there are some things that are constructed, they're constructs, and there are other things that are not. There are things that we discover. Now, a hardcore constructivist says everything is constructed because you have to receive everything through your perception. and your perceptions are constructed by your brain. When you see things with your eyes, that's your brain interpreting signals of light that hit your eyes, and so that's a construct too. And your mind working things out, that's your mind constructing things, so those are constructs too. So even things like the basic rules of logic, they're constructs. Now, that's not true. There are plenty of things that we discover, not construct, and most of the time when you look at your life, there's the various systems and institutions and ways we go about doing things. They're probably a mix of the two. There's some things that are considerably more objective in the sense that we discover them, and usually there's some things that are constructs, and there's kind of a mix of the two of those in most of our lives, and sometimes it's even a little difficult to differentiate the two, but there are clear things that are constructs, like the legal system, and there are clear things that are not, like the fact that go dig in that strat over there and you can find dinosaur fossils, or the basic rules of logic, and so on and so forth. So what those, for lack of a better term, I'll call hardcore constructivists do is take the good point that, hey, we construct some things, and then they fail to make the distinction between the fact that we construct some things and there's other things we do not, and they see everything through the lens of constructivism. That's actually a problem that happens with most isms and philosophies you can come up with, is people tend to, when they find something that's really great like that or has a good point, they tend to then see everything through that and fail to recognize the limitations therein. I fell into a similar problem when I was in college when I first heard about postmodernism, and I started blaming every ill of the world on postmodernism. Now, some elements of postmodernism are really bad and do cause a lot of trouble, but is it really responsible for every ill of our society? No, I was making that error of seeing everything through that lens, and the hardcore constructivist does the same thing. Some things are constructs, some things are not. Now, if you take the idea that all or most things are constructs, which seems to be in the vein of where Nietzsche was going, even if he wouldn't go completely all the way, well then everything can be deconstructed. Things can be broken down into their components and deconstructed. You can break the legal system down. It's possible to do. Now, how useful that is depends on what you're trying to accomplish. You can deconstruct a building, and if you're trying to do that because, hey, you've got a better building to put in its place, that's a good thing. If you're trying to deconstruct it because it got damaged in a storm and you're trying to repair it, that can be a good thing. If you're trying to deconstruct the legal system because you see problems inherent in it, and you're trying to figure out, well, where is this problem? Is there something going wrong with the way prosecutors are prosecuting cases? Is it because defense attorneys aren't doing their job? Do judges have too much power? Do judges have too little power? So if you're trying to break it down to figure out, well, where's the problem? Well, that can be a good thing too. Now, this is especially poignant in things like stories, because all stories are constructs made by their authors, and so you can deconstruct them. You can look at, well, what was the author trying to say by this particular character and putting them in this story, as opposed to looking at the story as a whole. You can do that with certain elements of the plot. You can do that even to the point where, well, why did the author name this character this way and not that way? And this is especially the case when you're talking about, say, fictional stories of any kind, whether it's a film or a book or even a video game or something like that. In video games, you can deconstruct even the mechanics of the game itself. Although I think it's questionable how successful this was. I know of some games where they tried to put the player in a situation where they felt uncomfortable with the violence the character they were playing as was performing. The idea being, hey, we want to communicate that there's something wrong with this level of violence. Now, I don't think in the cases that I can think of where they did that, it really worked very well, but you can see, oh, that's an element of how you would deconstruct it. One that I can remember pretty well was called Spec Ops the Line, and this game was probably, I want to say 10 years ago now, and it was a third-person military game where you're some special ops soldiers going into, I think it was supposed to be Dubai after a sandstorm. It essentially covered the whole city, and you were looking for survivors or a military another military unit that had been stranded there. And what the developers of the game tried to do is put your character in situations where the violence kept escalating, but it seemed like you were justified in the decisions you make. oh, well, you're firing at people who would traditionally be non-combatants, but they fired at you first. And so the next time you see people who are in that same group, you fire at them first rather than risking getting killed, and things along those lines. And eventually they brought it to the point where you fire white phosphorus, which is a horrific stuff that is actually firing it on civilians, and even other soldiers nowadays is considered like a war crime, as I understand it, because of how horrific that stuff is. It will burn through your skin. If you ever get white phosphorus on you, the only thing you can really do is take out a knife and start cutting off your flesh, because it's not going to stop burning, even if you jump in water. That's how bad this stuff is. And so they put the character in a situation where you order, and yourself actually do, fire white phosphorus on what turns out to be a bunch of civilians. And I remember from what the developers talked about, what they were trying to do was instill in you the horror of the violence and the horror of war. But I don't think it really worked very well, because you still had a big disconnect between yourself and the character in the game. And it was such a escalation, such a quick jump. They didn't ramp it up as slowly as they thought they did. So that's an example of where they were attempting to do something like that, but I don't think it actually worked very well. And in a certain respect, when I say, oh, this is what they were trying to do, but it didn't work, you could actually categorize what I'm doing here as me deconstructing the game. I'm looking at the author's intent, I'm looking at the mechanics, I'm looking at the story, and I'm determining, here's what they attempted to do, here's the components they used that attempted to do it, here's how it didn't work, and here's why I think it didn't work. So that's somewhat of an effort at deconstructionism, loosely speaking. And you can apply the same thing, as I said, to governmental systems, philosophical systems, political systems, and even theological systems. An example that comes to my mind is last year I worked through Eleanor Stump's book on the Atonement with some friends, and she has a pretty good theory of the Atonement. It's a theological system, and you could, if you wanted to, one way of looking at it is deconstruct it down to its components, where her idea of how the atonement works depends on a certain social theory about how people can do mind reading, not in the sense of being a psychic, but in the sense of you can look at somebody and understand their emotions. It also depends on a certain philosophical view of God's relation into time. It depends on some more widely accepted, very traditional Christian views like anti-Pelagianism and the idea of Christ's embodiment and things along those lines. And so her theory only works if all those components, and there were other ones as well, if they all come together. So if you're wanting to understand her theory a little better, well, you can deconstruct it down to the components and then analyze those components and be like, well, is the theory of how God relates to time that she's working with, is that a plausible theory? And if it is, then hey, maybe her theory, the whole theory of the atonement works. And if you conclude, no, God's relation to time is not the Thomistic view that Stump takes there, well, then her whole theory wouldn't work. Now, I hope you should see that this gets a little bit more complicated whenever you start talking about things that are a little bit different, like, can you really deconstruct a historical event? Well, in a certain sense, historical events are made up of components. There's various people who did various things, and you can abstract off the fact that, say, King Leonidas was at the Battle of Thermopylae from the fact that the Battle of Thermopylae happened. But it's not like there was an author who was saying, what kind of point do I want my readers to take when I put King Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae? No, that was just a historical event that happened. So those aren't constructed in the same way, so then it's a bit more iffy as to how you would go about deconstructing them, or if it would even be useful and valid and good to do that. Because sometimes you can break things down in ways where it doesn't really end up making a lot of sense. I mean, maybe in the case of the Battle of Thermopylae, depending on your view of God and sovereignty, you could say that God is the author of that, and maybe try and say, well, what was God trying to tell us through this? But it doesn't really work for, say, the human historian who's writing about it in any way, at least not in the same way. Maybe you could apply it loosely to speaking to how that particular historian presented it, but the actual fact that it happened, you can't really deconstruct it in the same way that you can other things. And this is part of where deconstructionism starts to go off the rails, where you can clearly do this very easily and very well with some things, but there's other things where it gets pretty iffy, And then there's other things where you can't really do it at all, at least not without doing a great deal of violence to the thing itself. Because there are some things in life that are more than the sum of their parts. And so this gets into an idea that I think I've mentioned on the podcast here before, that you can find different terms for this, but it's the idea of emergent properties. Now, everything has properties, like I have the property of being a man, of being an American, of being 39 years old, and so on and so forth. That's just basic philosophy. Well, emergent properties are the idea that there are properties that only emerge when a certain collection of things comes together, and you're not going to find that property anywhere in the individual parts of those collections. So I think an easy example of that is, like my dog, in some senses, you could say he's a collection of all the various tissues, cells, organs, hair, and other things that make up his body. But if you manage to break him down into all those individual components, you're not going to find the property of being a dog anywhere in any of those things. You only get that property when all of those things come together. And this can be a little bit of a controversial thing in philosophy, because there's some people who doubt the existence of emergent properties. But another example that's very popular in philosophical circles is a lot of philosophers think consciousness itself is an emergent property of brain states. When you get states of the brain that are significantly complex enough, then consciousness emerges. Now, I actually don't think myself personally that that's a very reasonable theory to explain consciousness, but it's just an example of where you would get the idea of emergentism coming in. And I think, at least in general, emergentism or emergent properties are a thing that we actually see and observe in the world. There are cases where the whole is more than just the sum of its parts. Sometimes there are things that are more than just the sum of their parts. Now, there are cases, I think, where you could say it's actually vague as to when that property comes about. Like, say, take my dog again. Suppose you only broke him down in the sense that, well, he had 3 legs instead of 4. Would he still be a dog? Well, I think yes. I think he would still have that property of being a dog. So, but if you broke him down to just his individual cells and there was nothing there, you had nothing but all those individual cells, would he be a dog anymore? Well, probably not. And there's some vagueness in there as to where does he gain the property of being a dog and where does he lose it. You can easily see that with, like, say, the example of a car. Any car that you drive is a collection of various components. It's a collection of the engine and all the components of the engine, the chassis, the structure, the windows, all the plastic and metal that makes it up, and so on and so forth. And you can take some of those components away, and it'll still be a car in a reasonable sense. But at a certain point in there, it's probably not going to really be a car anymore as soon as you've divided all those components out enough. Now, where exactly it is a car and where it isn't, there's probably some vagueness in there, even though I think we can agree that, hey, if you've got all the components disassembled, it's not a car anymore. And if you have them all assembled, it is. And somewhere in there, it gains or loses that property depending on which direction you're going. And the fact that there's that vagueness in there as to, well, when does it gain the emergent property and when does it lose it, is one of the main reasons why some philosophers are skeptical of the idea of emergent properties. And so I bring that up as an illustration of the fact that it seems to me that deconstructionism is right in that some things can be deconstructed, but then there are other times where if you do deconstruct it, you've lost whatever that emergent property is. There are some things that simply cannot be broken down further than they already are. I would say things like the good with a capital G is one of those things. Time is another one of those things. Maybe in certain senses, certain expressions of love and beauty are those things that where they're not something that can be broken down without doing such violence to the idea or thought or concept itself that it's not really the idea, thought, or concept anymore. Since this is all about stories, I'll use some more stories as an example. There's an ongoing trend in a lot of contemporary film and TV media where they're attempting to deconstruct and reinvent old stories, old mythologies, and not like mythologies from the ancient past, but like stories from the 70s and 80s. We saw this with Star Wars, with Star Trek, The week I'm recording this, they put out a new Masters of the Universe called, like, Revelation, I think, which is stories about He-Man. Now, I was never into He-Man as a kid, but apparently the people who are saying, oh, this is a travesty. This is nothing like the Masters of the Universe, the He-Man that we liked as kids. You've taken everything that was great about that and destroyed it. And I use this as an illustration to this point because as soon as you're thinking about things this way, what you can see is, well, the Masters of the Universe cartoon from the 80s, well, that was a work of fiction, so in a certain sense, you can deconstruct it. You can look at its components, you can look at what the author intended, you can look at these characters and these plot settings, even like how the cartoon was drawn, and then look at how that relates to the whole, and you can break it down and analyze it and study it that way. But when you do that a lot, you lose something that the original cartoon had. And what these fans of the original cartoon are saying about this new series on Netflix is they've lost the plot. They've lost what made the original series good and great. And yeah, you have the same characters you have characters with the same names, but they're not the characters from the original 80s cartoon. And yeah, the animation is better because it's almost 40 years later now, but we don't care. We would prefer those original stories because that had something that had for lack of a better term, it had like a Masters of the Universe-ness, a Masters of the Universe essence, something about the story that made it a Masters of the Universe story that this new thing is lacking. And if you're a fan of stories at all like I am, although it's often very hard to put that into words, you can get a sense of that. If you watch a lot of films by the same director, you get a sense of, oh, this director has a certain style. Christopher Nolan's movies have a certain style. Wes Anderson's movies have a certain style. Steven Spielberg's movies have a certain style. Quentin Tarantino's movies have a certain style. To the point where if you've watched a couple of them, you're going to recognize, oh, this is a Tarantino movie. Oh, this is a Wes Anderson movie. This is a Nolan movie. Because they kind of tend to do things the same way. And you can even go beyond that from, say, like the director of a movie or a TV show and be like, well, there's a certain type of way Star Trek stories were done in the 80s and 90s, which is different than how they're being done now, regardless of whether you think that's good or not. My wife is a big Harry Potter fan, and there's a certain, for lack of a better term, Harry Potterness to stories that occur in that universe, to the point where people who are big fans of that series and big fans of those characters will recognize if somebody writes a story that they claim is in the Harry Potter universe, but it kind of breaks those rules a little bit, they're going to say, no, that's not a Harry Potter story. And so this is what I'm getting at when I get at the idea that, hey, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, at least in some cases with some things. And I think with a lot of stories, especially if they're good stories, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. There's something about a really, really good story where there's just more to it than what you can get at by deconstruction. And that's what I think is part of what's going on, where in a lot of these contemporary reimaginings or reworkings or whatever term you want to use of older properties, is the people are deconstructing it and then attempting to rework it, but they've lost the thing that made the original story special in the minds of the fans, because that's not something that you can retain when you deconstruct it and break it down. The whole of the story is more than the sum of its parts. And now, with that, I will say that there is a distinction I want to make between what I'm going to term hard deconstructionism and soft deconstructionism. And what I'm talking about in stories is more in the line of soft deconstructionism as opposed to hard deconstructionism. Hard deconstructionism is essentially incoherent because it winds up saying things like you can't even know an author's intention. And if you can't know an author's intention, then you can't even understand any story because the author who made the story had intentions, and therefore you run into all kinds of problems. Hard deconstructionism is philosophically incoherent. Soft deconstructionism, although in recent years it's given us, I would say, a lot more bad stories, it is the kind of thing where it sometimes can lead to interesting and useful stories. I've mentioned these examples before, but there's a story that was written called Grendel, which is the retelling of the story of Beowulf from the perspective of the first monster he fights. And that's interesting, and that's an example of soft deconstructionism where a person's looking at the story of Beowulf and saying, well, what was the author trying to say here? How do these elements all work together? Let's deconstruct it, twist it around a little bit, put it back together, and see if we get something interesting. And in that case, you did. I think I mentioned it before as well, that a Star Wars story from a video game about 20 years ago now called Knights of the Old Republic 2 did soft deconstructionism very well as well, where it looked at the Star Wars mythos and said, well, you've got the Jedi against the Sith, and loosely speaking, the Jedi are like these Zen Buddhists who say, deny everything that makes you human in order to be better and serve mankind, or humankind, or excuse me, there's alien sentient species in Star Wars, in order to serve all sentient life. And then contrasting those Jedi, you've got these Sith who take like a ultra extreme Nietzschean or Ubermenchian view of the world and say, oh, don't deny the things that make you human, and step on and push out and kill anyone who gets in the way of you to get what you want. And if you can't step on them, push them out of the way, or kill them, then you're just not strong enough, and you either need to get strong enough or you need to die. And what this game did, essentially, is attempt to deconstruct both of those by saying, hey, there's something horrifically wrong with a code of life that says deny the very things that make you human. And at the same time, there's something horrifically wrong with a code of life that says be the strongest you can be at the expense of everyone else. And it attempted to try and find some kind of a middle ground, a way of not reconciling the two and saying that, oh, they're the same, they make the same errors, but saying that there's something wrong with the Jedi, there's something wrong with the Sith. Is there a third way forward? And that was a very interesting story as well. And I would say those are examples of, at least possibly, soft deconstructionism done well. Where unfortunately it seems like most of the media that's come out within the last 5 or so years is soft deconstructionism done very, very poorly. And I think part of the distinction there is that if you're going to do soft deconstructionism well, you need to have something to say. You need to be exploring a question. You need to have a theme you're looking to explore. You need to have something to say. And a lot of the bad examples of soft deconstructionism in stories these days, they have nothing to say. It's all about tearing something down and then just leaving it torn down. It's not about tearing a story down for the purposes of rebuilding it to say something better. And another Star Wars example, the movie The Last Jedi from probably 4 or 5 years ago now. I don't keep track of the years of these as much as I should, I guess. Anyhow, that's a perfect example of doing deconstructionism where you have nothing to say. All that movie was interested in doing was tearing everything down that had come before it. But then, when it had the chance to say, okay, we've torn everything down, we have nothing left, let's rebuild, it didn't have anything to say. It didn't rebuild anything. Everything was just left. In fact, I remember when we walked out of that movie theater, I said to my wife, where's there to go in this story at this point? They've destroyed all their momentum, and you can kind of see that in how the movie that came after that was floundering all over in place, because there was no more momentum left in the story, because they torn everything down that came before, but it built up nothing in its place before. So at least in my mind, I would say that's one of the good key distinctions between soft deconstructionism that works and can tell us useful, interesting, and good stories, and soft deconstructionism, which is basically just crap, is, well, does this story have something to say? Every good story should have something to say. And unfortunately, it seems like most of the stuff that's coming out these days, people are just so keen on doing soft deconstructionism that they forget, oh, our story has to have something to say. It has to have a theme. It has to have a purpose. It has to have some conflict it's exploring. It has to have some question it's trying to find an answer to. There has to be something more going on than just tearing everything down. Okay, so because I said I'd mention postmodernism as well, let me get into that. Postmodernism is, loosely speaking, the rejection of modernism. So a little bit like deconstructionism, you need to know what modernism is. Now, modernism is, roughly and loosely speaking, a philosophical idea that we, that is human or mankind, we can do it. We can build these great things. We can conquer any goal. We can climb any mountain. The age that was right around and right before World War II, the Industrial Revolution, you can say, loosely speaking, that was a very modernistic age, a very modernistic idea. World War II came in and essentially killed modernism. But the idea behind it was, we set our sights high enough, we work hard enough, we make ourselves smart enough, we, mankind, we can do whatever we want to. It's a very triumphant philosophy, for lack of a better term. If you ever read any of Anne Rand's writing, she's extremely modernistic. Atlas Shrugged is one of the most modernistic novels I've ever read, because it's filled with this idea of, hey, mankind can be great if these other people will stop just dragging us down. We can build everything. We can do anything we want. We can conquer any goal if we'll just get our heads screwed on right. Well, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, but that idea is all over in that novel and all over in Ayn Rand's writings. And so postmodernism, among other things, is the rejection of that idea of saying, well, no, we can't. And the broadest possible way to define it and categorize it and express that is, it's a rejection of all meta-explanations, meta-systems, and meta-ideas. And what I mean by a meta-system or a meta-idea, or meta-explanation, is something that explains everything. So, loosely speaking, Christianity is a meta-system. That is, it's a system, an idea, a religion, a philosophy that attempts to explain everything we see in the world. And postmodernism is the rejection of that. And as a consequence, Ayn Rand was, I believe, and I'm pretty confident of this, the last philosopher who attempted to develop her own metasystem and say, I can explain all of reality through my philosophy. Before postmodernism came on the scene, there were lots of philosophers who did that. In fact, it seemed like it was kind of a requirement of every major philosopher that they develop their own metasystem and say, here, my philosophy can explain everything we see. And loosely speaking, usually those were based off of either the works and tradition that came through Aristotle or the works and tradition that came through Plato. But again, of course, it's always a little more complicated, but you could usually group them into those two categories. Now, the trouble is, and this is jumping over things a little bit because I want to make this brief because I got to get back to work on packing up for our move, is that once you reject the idea that we can do it and incorporate the idea of at the least suspicion of any meta-explanation, then authorial intention comes into doubt, because at least within the context of a novel, a story, or a film or something, the author's intentions is a meta-explanation for what's going on there. Why did, say, you want to ask why J.R.R. Tolkien broke up the Christ figure in The Lord of the Rings between Aragorn, Gandalf, and Frodo? Well, that's authorial intention. That explains everything that's going on there. Therefore, under postmodernism, you need to be suspicious of that, if not reject it entirely. So what happens at that point? Well, if you can no longer know or get at the author's intention, then it's all about reader response. How does it make you feel that J.R.R. Tolkien did that? What do you think about that? And since we don't have the author's intention to appeal to when you say, well, here's what I think Tolkien intended, and I disagree and say, well, here's what I think Tolkien intended, and without a foundation to appeal to where we can look and go, well, who's right? If there's no authorial intention, you don't really have a foundation to appeal to settle disputes like that. So what it all decays into is into power games. It's not who can make the better case in that sense. It's who has more power to promote their viewpoint. And, well, that might not seem to make much of a difference if we're arguing about, well, what was Tolkien's intent. See, I reject this whole theory, so I slipped into arguing about it from an authorial intention thing. So it might not make more sense it might not seem like it makes much of a difference if we're talking about why is the Christ figure split into three persons in Lord of the Rings, but it makes a great deal of difference in many, many other areas of life. What if you're arguing that we can't get at the authorial intention of what Christ meant in his words that are recorded in the Gospels? What if we can't get at the authorial intention of the authors of the Gospels or of Paul? And on we can go there. What if we can't get at the authorial intention of the Founding Fathers when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? If that is the case, then really all there is left is power games of, well, these people think differently. There's no foundation, no judge or arbiter or common ground with which to settle the dispute. So it's all power games and who can get the most power to enforce their view at this point. So in many senses, if you've watched HBO's series Game of Thrones and you look at it like that, that is the most honest and open postmodern series or story that I've ever seen, because everything in that series is all about power, who has it, who can get it, and what they will do to get it. And that's what postmodernism essentially leaves you with, is it's all about power. Now, there are many people who will say that's not really the way it is, but I'm just going to argue you just haven't followed it through to its logical conclusion. When you embrace this postmodern ideal that you can't know the authorial's intention, maybe you haven't gone all the way down the track there to it's all about power games yet, but that's coming if you follow it to its logical conclusion. And so when it comes to stories, Postmodernism essentially gives you things like Game of Thrones, which tend to be, for lack of a better term, very often very cynical and nihilistic stories. And not that that's necessarily bad. Some cynical and nihilistic stories are actually very entertaining and very good, and we can learn some things from them. But you tend to get stories like that that are very cynical and nihilistic, that don't tend to conform to the rules of good stories, the rules of the monomyth, and the rules of the archetypes that I've talked about before. And I will say that if you get a very, very skilled storyteller, you can sometimes make that work, as I would argue the first couple of seasons of Game of Thrones showed us. I think they kind of work and hold together fairly well as a story, but clearly the people running it weren't quite as skilled as they thought they were, because it all fell apart at the end. And I would actually want to argue if at the end, instead of continuing to go the postmodern route, if they'd fallen back on those archetypes and the monomyth and things like that, the story probably would have ended better and satisfied some people more. Because, and I'll make this point just to wrap up, if you do think, like me, that there really is something about, say, the monomyth and archetypes and things along those lines, that there's a good reason why certain stories have been told and retold in the same way and in similar fashions for hundreds, if not thousands of years in human societies, and it's because they represent some manifestation of this monomyth or of archetypes and things along those lines, then what that means is those really are the stories people crave. There's something in our very nature or souls that we have as human beings where those are the stories we want to hear. Now, we'll flirt with the postmodernistic and deconstructionist stories for a while, but in the end, we do want to see some type of heroic triumph over evil. We don't want to see evil win. In the end, we do want things that happened along the way to matter in some sense or other. And if you end the story by rejecting it, that's going to leave people with a sour taste in their mouth, as Game of Thrones did. Now, of course, there's many other things that were going on there, so it's not like this is the only explanation there is, but I think it's a good one in the sense that it enlightens us as to what is going on with stories. So that'll be my quick podcast on deconstructionism and postmodernism in the context of stories. As I said, strong deconstructionism, strong postmodernism, philosophically incoherent, kind of, usually speaking, pretty dumb and self-contradictory. Sometimes you can get good stories with more of a soft deconstructionist or soft postmodern approach, although I think it's very, very difficult to do. And the good rule of thumb there is you need to have something to say after you tear everything down. Tear everything down if you have to tell your good story, but have an idea of what you're trying to build up after you tear everything down. If your whole goal is just to tear everything down and you have nothing left to say at that point, you're just going to end up telling a bad and unsatisfying story that just leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth. So, as always, write in and let me know what you think. You can reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. Hit me up on the Facebook page. I always like getting feedback from listeners. I'm hoping that we're going to get through with our move in the next week or two here, and once we're in the new house and I get everything set up, I'll hopefully get back on a reasonable schedule for getting these podcasts out. I do appreciate your patience as I'm trying to do this. And also, hopefully in the new house, I'll have an office that's quieter, where I'll be able to do this more often without you hearing my kids screaming and pounding on the walls in the background. And not that my kids are bad, this is just what a 5 and 2-year-old do, scream and pound on things. So anyhow, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back again with something else for you on stories next time.
The mission of Holy Apostles College and Seminary is to form faithful witnesses of Christ. Year after year, the prestigious Newman Guide has recommended Holy Apostles for our academic excellence and steadfast fidelity to the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church. We are also fully accredited and the leader in Catholic online learning. Our students enjoy the unsurpassed flexibility to study on their own time and anywhere in the world through asynchronous engagement. Holy Apostles is dedicated to the relentless pursuit of truth, which allows students in all academic programs, including undergraduate, graduate, and personal interest, to formulate a coherent worldview based on both faith and reason. The study of the liberal arts also develops and refines key competencies associated with career readiness, such as critical thinking and problem solving, clear communication, collaboration, and a strong work ethic. The tuition rate at Holy Apostles is one of the most affordable in the country. Yearly tuition for a full-time undergraduate is under $12,000. Students at Holy Apostles can graduate with minimal or even no college debt, which enables them to live out their calling as faithful witnesses of Christ without heavy financial burdens holding them back. Please visit www.holyapostles.edu/admissions for more information. The Fall 2021 admissions deadline is Friday, July 23rd. Classes start Monday, August 30th. See you soon!
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.